All right, so this is part 6 of the review, and what we're going to be doing is continuing our look at politics. So as we've discussed, political parties are really important in the US. We have political parties in Congress, which when we looked at Congress, we said these can help facilitate collective action. And that is basically the reason we have parties in Congress, to facilitate collective action, to make lawmaking possible, right? We have way too many laws for every Congress member to read every single bill that comes through, right? There are hundreds, if not thousands of pages per law, and it just would be way too much. So parties can make it easier, right? They can, in this case, reduce information costs. Because if I'm a Democrat and I know President Biden, also a Democrat, wants me to vote for the bill, I'm probably going to vote for it. If I'm a Republican and I know President Biden wants me to vote for the bill, I'm probably going to vote against it, right? So parties really reduce these information costs. I now don't need to know anything about the bill. All I need to know is how Biden wants me to vote on it, right? Makes my life much easier. And certainly party leadership can provide the same cues, right? Because Biden isn't going to weigh in on every single piece of legislation, but our party leaders can serve that purpose as well. And as I said, they also facilitate collective action in that they make deal making easier, right? They can control their members and keep these coalitions together to make all Democrats vote one way, or to have all Republicans vote one way, or to say, no, we're going to have bipartisan cooperation, meaning both parties cooperating this time, because the party leaders have worked it out and made that possible, right? Parties also provide sort of some stability, because remember we talked about log rolling in terms of committees, and I said, the person on the Agriculture Committee wants a transportation bill, and the person on the Transportation Committee wants an agriculture bill, they will both agree to release each other's bills, right? Well, they can't do it at exactly the same time. So one is going to have to go first, which means the other could just defect, could not release the bill, could say, I got mine and you get nothing. And we know that iterative games that keep getting played, that won't happen, because you'll never work with the person again. You'll never believe them again. But what happens if the person is retiring or leaving office to run for another office, maybe, or to go into the private sector, what have you? So now we have agriculture and transportation, and the agriculture person is leaving. Well, can transportation trust that the agriculture person will release the agriculture bill they want? Maybe not, except because parties form these coalitions, and we can be pretty sure that the person leaving will be replaced with a person of the same party because the demographics of the district haven't changed. Then transportation over here can trust that even if the agriculture thing doesn't get done, that Congress, the next Congress, the new person sitting there from that party will do it too, right? So parties can help facilitate that trust and those long-term agreements, even as members leave, right? And they can allow us to form these coalitions that facilitate that. Obviously, parties in the electorate are for us, for the voters, right? They provide an easy voting queue. We know that a Democrat is going to believe in these certain things and a Republican is going to believe in these other things. So we know basically what we're getting if we vote for a Democrat or if we vote for a Republican. Now, that incentivizes politicians to join parties, right? Because if we know what the Democrats and the Republicans stand for, it makes it easier for us to vote. But it doesn't make it easy for us to vote for a third party because we don't necessarily know what those parties stand for. So we are more likely to vote for the two major parties. Also more likely to vote for the two major parties because we're strategic and we'd like our vote to not just be thrown away on a third party candidate who will never win. So politicians really have to join the parties to win. Now, another reason for that is the parties are gatekeepers for the primary elections. So if you're not in a major party, you may not be able to join in the primary elections, which means that you get a lot less exposure and people won't know and won't have voted for you in the primaries. So why would they vote for you in the general election? So it's really important for candidates to have a party. Basically makes it possible to win. It's very rare for politicians at a higher level, so federal offices, president, House, and Senate. It's very rare for them to win without being a member of a major party. There are a few independents in Congress, but they are very few and far between. So candidates obviously gain a lot from this, but they also lose something. They are forced to conform. Basically, there are conformity costs imposed on them, right? You're not going to see a pro-choice Republican or a pro-life Democrat very often. Is this because every single person who joins the Republican Party is pro-life and every single person who joins the Democratic Party is pro-choice? Maybe it's pretty big issues, and that might, someone who's pro-life might think I'm a Republican because of that. But for the most part, people have diverse sets of beliefs, and there may be pro-choice Republicans and pro-life Democrats, but you're not going to see them running for office very often. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't hold that set of beliefs. It just means that they have to conform to the party line. So we saw that, for example, with Biden. Biden actually has said things like, I am pro-life, but I believe that the government should not play a role in this. It is not the government's business. So I do not want to impose my personal pro-life beliefs on the country. So I am pro-choice in that sense, right? He supports choice, the pro-choice position, which is typically associated with Democrats, because he doesn't want to impose his views on everyone. Now, he may truly, deeply, 100% believe that. But at the same time, that is evidence that there are these conformity costs being imposed on him, right? He must conform. If he hadn't done that, it seems very unlikely he would have won the Democratic nomination. So we see that, right? That there are these conformity costs. Candidates must adopt at least some of the party's positions, and oftentimes these big sort of obvious positions, the ones that we in the public know about, right? So that's can be really important for candidates and really tough for them because they've got to navigate this. They need the party, but they're not going to agree with 100% of the things the party stands for. Now, why do we only have two parties? I already hinted at this, that we only have two parties, that third parties were just sort of throwing away our votes. The reason for that is because the first past the post voting system, right? It's the plurality winner takes all. This person with the most votes wins everything. And that means that third parties will naturally sort of not have a lot of power. This is Duverger's law. It's just the math of it. We will always see a first past the post voting system devolve into a two-party system. If you're interested in that, I did post a video about it in our suggested viewing from the class on parties. Now, we have this idea, right, that we need parties for elections. Well, one reason that this comes into play is because of campaign finance. Parties are helpful for candidates because they can siphon funding to the candidate. Now, another source of funding is interest groups, right? Interest groups can provide funding for candidates, and they can also run independent expenditures for candidates, meaning that they can spend independently of a political campaign as long as they're not directly advocating for that candidate or against the candidate's opponent, but rather for issues. They can do a lot during campaigns. We saw this with the NRA ad. It was an independent expenditure by the NRA's Political Action Committee, or PAC. And it was very obvious they wanted us to vote against Clinton, but they didn't actually say vote against Clinton, so they could run that ad. Now, this ability of interest groups to participate in elections can sometimes give us the opinion that interest groups are actually buying candidates and therefore buying votes in Congress. And we don't think that that's really true. We haven't seen it in any studies. In fact, interest groups at most buy sort of time and effort from candidates. So the NRA was never, ever going to run an ad for Clinton. It wouldn't matter how much they helped Clinton. Clinton was never going to support them. So clearly the interest group didn't buy Trump's vote any more than they would have been able to buy Clinton's vote. However, maybe in Congress, they might be able to buy time, right? The NRA probably isn't turning any Congress member pro-gun, right? The Congress members who the NRA supports are already going to be pro-gun. But maybe that sort of activates these Congress members to talk more about their pro-gun positions and sponsor more legislation related to it, right? Or speak out against legislation that would restrict this right. So that may be how interest groups influence the lawmaking process. Now, interest groups do struggle sometimes to sort of coordinate their action, especially larger interest groups with more diverse interests. But ultimately, many of them are quite successful in coordinating their members' action and getting things done and achieving their political goals. Now, again, one of the ways they can achieve these goals is through these independent expenditures, right? If the NRA can get a pro-gun person elected, they're going to have more of a chance of getting the legislation they want through Congress and stopping legislation they don't want, right? So to do this, they might spend on these, again, independent expenditures. This is typically soft money, it's called, right? We know from Buckley versus Vallejo, soft money is money spent outside of a campaign that is not coordinated with the campaign, that advocates for an issue rather than for a candidate. Now, these ads, they can usually have a lot of money to spend on it. But at the same time, we do know where the money comes from. So soft money spent primarily by PACs, and to some extent by parties, we know where that money comes from. There are certain reporting requirements for those donors. There are also certain reporting requirements for hard money donors. Now, hard money is the money given directly to a candidate, right? That is the most strictly regulated. The idea is we don't want people to be able to buy candidates. We don't even want the appearance that that's happening, right? Even if it definitely doesn't happen, we'd like to avoid even the appearance that it could be. So there are very strict regulations on how much money can be donated to a candidate. You cannot donate anonymously. Well, you can, it's a very small amount that you donate anonymously. So that limits basically how much money a campaign can spend because they need to raise a lot of money. But we know there are no strict legal limits on how much money a campaign can spend. Campaign can spend as much money as they have. So the reason for that is in Buckley versus Vallejo, the court held that money is speech, right? Campaigns need the money to get their voice heard. And when we donate money to a campaign, we are speaking our support of that campaign through that donation, right? So money is speech. That's why our donations are protected and why campaign expenditures are protected. Now, again, hard money, there are pretty strict requirements about exactly how much people can donate and how that money can be used. Soft money, again, is a little bit looser. There are still clear requirements on reporting who's donated what and how the money is used. And remember, there are those magic words that soft money ads cannot say. So the NRA ad was a soft money ad, so it couldn't say vote against Clinton, but it can still get its message across pretty clearly. Now, dark money is different. Dark money is spent typically by not-for-profits. What this is, money spent by charities to, again, advocate for an issue. They also would not be using these magic words. But what's different about dark money is there are no reporting requirements, right? Because charities are not required to collect information on who gives them money. So you can donate as much as you want to a charity anonymously. This means that dark money spending can come from any source and we don't necessarily know what it is. Now, Citizens United opened up a lot of dark money spending and a lot of it opportunity for independent expenditures from dark money and from soft money sources. There was a concern after it that corporations would get really involved and maybe because they have so much money, they would be able to sort of buy candidates. But we haven't seen that happening, mainly because corporations don't really want to get involved in politics, right? It's not worth it to them. They just want consumers to buy their products. So they'd rather lobby Congress than actually provide campaign support for candidates. So we see then that for the most part, Citizens United has not changed the campaign environment that much, but it has caused some influx of dark money. So we will see sort of Citizens United was relatively recent as the political system goes. So we will see how this impacts us over the next years. Now, money, of course, is needed for a campaign, right? If you don't have money, you can't run a campaign. I mean, how would you run ads or even hire people to like go door to door? And even if they're volunteers, you probably got to serve them pizza, right? You have to have some money to have a campaign. But money isn't necessarily going to guarantee you a win, right? You have to have money. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. You also have to have voters who want to vote for you. So we've seen that sometimes all the money in the world will not save an unpopular candidate. Bloomberg, for example, ran in the Democratic primaries last time around, and he did not win. He self-funded. He sunk millions into his campaign, and he did extremely bad. He had a very poor showing in the Democratic primaries. Same with Tom Steyer, who again self-funded with just millions of dollars, and it didn't help because you still have to be a popular candidate. But candidate who ultimately won, Biden, it's not like he spent no money, right? He still spent a lot of money too. Now, this obviously I've been talking primarily there about congressional and presidential elections. And what's interesting is we can sort of draw these broad observations about presidential congressional elections. For example, that money is necessary but not sufficient. And we see that that's the case in presidential elections, like I just gave the example, but also in congressional elections. So Congress members will typically not raise a ton of money because incumbency is so important. The incumbency rates are so high, right? Once you're in office, you tend to get reelected, that you don't need to raise a lot of money. You need some, right? You need to have some campaign, but you don't need to raise a lot. So if an incumbent is all of a sudden raising a ton of money, we know they're pretty weak, right? They're worried about maybe a primary or general election challenge. So they're going to raise a lot of money to scare off any challenger and to make sure that if they have a challenger, they can effectively campaign against them. Now, challenger is probably going to be more effective in a midterm year. Well, I shouldn't say that. Challengers of certain parties have different ability in different years. And I realize that that's very sort of cryptic. So let's talk about that with some specifics. What I'm basically hinting at is surge and decline theory. Surge and decline theory says that the president's party will do well in Congress during presidential election years. So back last year in 2020, when President Biden was still candidate Biden, right, when he was running, he won, right? And Democrats did well. They gained seats in the House, right? They surged in. This is sometimes called the coattails effect, right? The president's coattails brought these Democrats into Congress. So that year, if you were a Democrat and there was a weak Republican, you stood a better chance of gaining their seat than in another year, right? Because Democrats surged in along with, I'm on campus and you know how the lights are on timers. We've seen that at Zoom, on our Zoom classes before. There we go. Sorry about that. So, right, Democrats surged in 2020. So Democrat was going to have more luck defeating a weak Republican than in other years. Now, next year in the 2022 midterms, we're likely to see the opposite, that Democrats will do poorly. That's decline. And that's because the president's party typically does badly in midterm years, right? So that will be a good time for Republicans to sort of pick off weak Democrats. And the reason for this basically is if during the surge, during the presidential years, we all get motivated and go out and vote for president, and people who don't vote during midterm years are likely to go out and vote during presidential years, and they're probably not going to know much about their congressional candidates. So just vote down the party line. So if they vote for Biden, they'll vote for Democrats all the way down, right? So we see that sort of surge in between party line voting and just the sort of excitement about this new president who we're about to elect, or in the case of, re-election, this president that we're about to re-elect. Yay, it's so exciting. Now, in midterm years, we're not so excited about the president. President's been president for 2 years, and as we know, they never actually meet our expectations. So we're probably a little bit meh, maybe even upset at the president. So we might vote for their opponents in the midterms to sort of show them, right? It's considered sometimes a referendum on the president. This, a couple of your readings pointed to that with Trump's midterm elections. Now there's also, because those sort of party line, low interest voters who only vote during presidential elections aren't there, we also see that factor removed. So typically the president's party loses seats during the midterm elections. This does not mean they lose control of the chamber, it just means they lose seats. Now, there are some exceptions to this theory, right? We know that since the end of World War II, the president's party has always experienced a surge during presidential election years. However, they've not always experienced the decline. There are 2 exceptions to this, right? The first exception is during the 1998 midterm elections. President Clinton was his second midterm. He should have seen, the Democrats therefore should have seen a seat loss in Congress. Democrats actually gained seats in Congress. So because the country was pretty fed up with Newt Gingrich and the Republicans in Congress. So it ended up being a referendum on what the Republicans were doing rather than on what the Democratic president was doing. Now, interestingly, the next midterm year, 2002, in 2002, this was not that long after 9/11. The country was still reeling from that and at war and in the start of the war in Afghanistan. And we were rallying around the president. So President Bush, George W. Bush, who was a Republican, gained more seats in the House, right? Republicans gained seats that year. And that was likely a response to 9/11 that we wanted to support the president and his efforts in the aftermath of that, right? So we see those 2 exceptions. Those are pretty exceptional circumstances. But other than that, we have seen no exceptions to the surge and decline theory. Now, in both these types of elections, presidential and congressional, parties play a role in the nominations. It's especially important in presidential elections, right? Because those nominating conventions, which are aired live on TV, those are really sort of glitzy and all the balloons and everything. And the candidates typically announce their nomination, their pick for their vice presidential candidate, right? So president picks the vice president, that'll typically be done there. The presidential candidate picks the vice presidential candidate, and that will be done at the conventions. So this is a really great time for the parties to sort of heal after the divisions of the primary, right? A hotly contested party primary can pull the party apart. So these nominating conventions are a great time for those divisions to be healed. Now, in campaigning, they coordinate campaigns. The parties might sort of help get one message out across all the campaigns. They can provide good campaigning resources. A new candidate for Congress, for example, is going to be able to get resources from the party about who are party voters and who has given money to the party in the past, right? So that's going to help them. They will also run get out the vote sort of drives. A lot of party soft money is spent on the sort of get out the vote campaigns very near the end of the election to get people to go and vote for your candidates. Now, in the electorate, obviously, we know that parties act as a cue for us. Now, presidential elections are a little bit different. We still typically vote party line. The single best predictor of how someone's going to vote is what party they're a member of. But we know that some people will vote for or against a presidential candidate because of the candidate themselves. So party matters ever so slightly less in presidential elections than in congressional elections. But again, it still matters a lot. Most voters will just vote their party. So it's, again, the reason why we see third-party candidates for president are never going to win the presidency, right? And we very rarely see it in Congress as well, that third-party candidates will win. Now, negative advertising. I showed you some negative ads in class. They're often a lot of fun to talk about. The reason we see negative ads, and we've seen somewhat of an influx of them, is that they're effective, right? They actually often tell voters more information than positive ads, right? Positive ads are often sort of feel good. Oh, look how great this person is. We like them. But negative ads can often really hit at like major issue points. Say, hey, this person is bad on these issues, right? So they can be very informative. Remember the ad that I played you that attacked Dukakis and his positions on crime? That was very informative, right? It was also arguably an exercise in racial priming that potentially tapped into underlying racism in the country. So it may have been, not a good ad from sort of a normative moral perspective, but it was possibly an effective ad in that it told us a lot about Dukakis. Told us way more than just sort of a feel-good ad about saying, hey, Dukakis, grew up here and did this, or like the Sanders ad with the like pictures of all the people who like Sanders, right? That didn't tell us much. So negative advertising is very informative, and it doesn't seem to stop people from wanting to vote. Now, I said it's effective. It may not be that effective. We're typically motivated reasoners, meaning that we're going to accept information that agrees with what we already think and reject information that doesn't. So a lot of the negative ads won't do any more than positive ads, right? They're not really going to change our mind. They're not persuasive. But even though they might not be persuasive, for most people, the people who haven't made up their minds can be persuaded by them. And again, because they typically have more content, they can really help inform those uninformed voters who don't really know much more than maybe party line. So that is a brief summary of the end of our politics unit. And for our next video, we'll be looking at review part 7 on policy.